Hello and welcome to the Master's Voice, the podcast series from Mediabrief.com. I'm your host and friend Pavan R Chawla, and before I tell you about the young masters I've invited to this episode, allow me to set the context for this episode. In 2017, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, or TRAI, came out with what I consider was a truly misplaced and uncalled for regulation of the broadcast industry, ostensibly for the greater consumer good, but with no research or data supporting that premise of its objective, and which later turned out to be, at TRAI's own admission, just price regulation that actually has eventually proven to be regressive, oppressive, and sector crushing. That latter, not by TRAI's admission, but really my own estimation, and that of a lot of people who've been observing the broadcast and entertainment industry, the media industry in India. TRAI literally hurled a spanner at the knees of the sector, and ever since, despite the pandemic, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which has had industry and the sector struggling desperately, the regulator, that's TRAI, went ahead with what seems to me to have been alarmingly misplaced haste to press ahead for an ironclad implementation of NTO 2. I had contemplated a special discussion on this topic with an industry expert or two, but what hastened the scheduling of this special episode was an excellent report that I saw from Coan Advisory Group studying the impact of all the regulation on the broadcast sector in India. An insightful, dispassionately chronicled report entitled Indian TV Broadcasting at a Crossroads, an assessment of regulatory outcomes and the way forward. And one quickly went ahead and invited two credible young experts and observers in the media and broadcast space. The two young masters I've invited to the show today are Vivan Sharan and Farah Bookwala. Vivan Sharan is a partner at the Coan Advisory Group, a policy research and advocacy firm based in New Delhi, and Farah Bookwala is an experienced multimedia journalist focused on the Indian media and entertainment industry. Farah, Vivan, welcome and thank you for participating in this, the latest episode of the Master's Voice podcast series on Mediabrief.com.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Before we proceed, Farah and Vivan, allow me to set the context further and quickly introduce the two of you to my listeners. Vivan Sharan is a partner at the Coan Advisory Group, a policy research and advocacy firm based in New Delhi. He previously served as the chief executive of the Global Governance Program at the Observer Research Foundation, ORF, and as the business head of a sustainability company that ran India's first energy efficiency index. Vivan is a visiting fellow at the ORF and on the board of the ECL Center, a technology policy think tank. He is also the author of Want, India in Search of an Economic Ideology, published by Bloomsbury in 2019. And now, quickly, a brief introduction of Farah Bookwala. Farah is currently a freelance journalist who spent more than 7 years as a full-time TV reporter at leading business news channel CNBC TV 18, which he tracked and reported on a wide range of sectors including consumer, hospitality, automobiles, aviation, and media and entertainment. In her current capacity, Farah writes long-form insight pieces on M&E for leading business portals, including CNBCTV18.com, moneycontrol.com, and others. Farah and Vivan, I have been in the media marketing advertising space since much before 1995. I was part of the team that launched Sony in India and all for the channel. So this is an area which is very close to my heart. And the whole objective of this is not to criticize anybody. I have a lot of respect for somebody who leads something like TRAI, but perhaps it's all the misguided persistence with things that do not work. So I just wanted to state that before we begin our discussion. So, the whole peg, the raison d'etre of this episode has been this wonderful report that Coan Advisory came out with, and it's entitled The Indian TV Broadcasting at a Crossroads, an assessment of regulatory outcomes and the way forward. And speaking from a personal viewpoint, this report actually very dispassionately and from a middle of the road space lists all the terrible things that this completely misguided, in my view, and this is not editorialized by the report, it's my view, okay, all the misguided meddling, the heavy-handed sledgehammer kind of regulation that has been thrust down the broadcasting industry's throats, as it were. So, Vivan, do you think that the two sectors that TRAI regulates have been sailing in the same boat, so to say?
Well, we have in telecom gone from 13 or so operators, that is Apex, to now about 3.5 operators, and the half being the government operator. Whereas in broadcasting, you've seen the reverse trajectory in some sense in terms of market, which is that we've now got over 900 channels, close to 100 broadcasters, over 700 free-to-air channels, and so on. So what you've seen in terms of market structure is that telecom has consolidated to a point where some may argue we may enter monopoly territory in another 5 years if another operator exists. Whereas broadcasting has actually become hyper-competitive. The reasons for the two are different, and we'll, I'm sure, discuss how regulations themselves have shaped these outcomes.
Farah, you had written a very wonderful, insightful piece, which was, which had a lot of your own insights also, and your own recommendations, your observations also over so many years of regulation, which the Coan Advisory report brought out really well. So Farah, in your view, what have been the outcomes of TRAI's regulation over the years?
Well, Pavan, at the very outset, I think it is important for us to state, as you have already said, but I think we'd like to put this point again, that this is not an attempt to vilify the TRAI for what it does. Rather, this is an attempt for me personally as a journalist and for Coan Advisory to sort of explain that despite the best intentions of the TRAI to regulate a sector which it was sort of, very unanimously just sort of given in 2004 to regulate. The attempt is rather to understand that despite its best intentions, why is it that the level playing field has been distorted to that extent today that the broadcasting industry feels very, very shortchanged. What I think particularly is important is the fact that the TRAI had 3 principles on the basis of which it was regulating the sector at the beginning, which the Coan Advisory also points out, which is that it wanted to bring in, usher in an era of transparency. It wanted to make television prices more affordable, and it wanted to enforce good quality of standards for TV viewers. The problem, however, as I see journalistically, has been the fact that over the years, the TRAI has not been able to balance the interests of various stakeholders. And there is sort of this attitude in the TRAI that the content creators are the set of people who need to be constantly told to wield or to stay in line, whereas the distributors, or rather the carriage operators, are sort of at the bottom of the pyramid, and therefore they need hand-holding, they need incentivization, they need a special emphasis and thrust, which is not how it should be. At the end of the day, the TRAI has equal responsibility towards each of the incumbents, be it the broadcasters, be it the consumers, and to that extent the carriage distributors and the last mile operators. And this is largely because, as I said, and which the Coan Advisory very, very categorically puts out, that there has not been enough emphasis on institutional expertise. So people who are part of the TRAI today are so heavily dependent on information and standpoints that are brought to them by various incumbents without having the ability to independently analyze what the outcome of that could be. So as Shivangi points out in the report, and I'll very briefly touch upon it, the entire emphasis of regulation has been on regulating prices in India, prices of television. And this, to my mind, is a bit of an issue because everybody knows that world over, India has one of the lowest television prices for the maximum content. As you already point out, in India, despite everything that has happened, we still have an ecosystem that supports 900 channels. Whereas in the telecom space today, we are down to, as Vivan said, only 3.5 incumbents.
And so many channels are being shut down too.
They are being shut down. They are absolutely, and they will be, because the regulation is not centered to be enabling, to be facilitatory. Rather, it has been very, very prescriptive to my mind.
Vivan, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I'd just like to take a step back and think about the history of regulation in India. Right. In the early 90s, we decided that we want to liberalize our markets. And therefore, there was a need to create these independent authorities that would oversee market growth and consumer welfare.
Right.
And subsequently, we've created close to a dozen regulators. But we've never actually paused and thought about the design of these regulators as pointed out. And this, in a sense, has been because the regulated sectors are where most investment activity tends to happen. These are sectors like aviation, energy, and of course, telecom and broadcasting, and financial markets most prominently, perhaps. Since there is so much investment activity, economic activity in these sectors, the performance of the regulator is somehow confused within that space because it's never really assessed, never deconstructed. Has the regulator been able to, or a regulator been able to manage disruptions in a particular market? That is always papered over because you look at an overall double-digit growth trajectory of many of these industries and you feel a sense of exuberance that they have been growing. But we have to pause for a minute and think about the fact that we've been growing from, of course, a low base in these industries. Some of them were non-existent before they came into being. And in a country like India with 1.3 billion people and an emerging economy at that, one should naturally expect that all of these industries, once they're opened up, liberalized, and with investments coming in, would flourish for a while. The key test of regulation doesn't lie in whether an industry has flourished after it has been opened. It lies in whether market transitions have been managed well, whether crises have been managed well, and whether the regulator has played any role in the development of resilience within a sector. I mean, COVID blows this wide open, this debate on resilience, and you see what is happening in aviation and other regulated sectors. So the point is that when our parliament legislates, they legislate with and give regulators a very broad mandate. So in the case of TRAI, there is a two-pronged mandate. One, ensure orderly market growth, and two, ensure consumer welfare. Now, all of TRAI's regulations are ostensibly within this framework, but remain untested. And that is the key problem because the last 2 years have shown that 26 million viewers have gone off TV. TV is in decline, in secular decline across developed markets, but is not so in developing markets, particularly in places like India, if you go by ad rates compared to digital. And therefore, the question is really whether the regulator will play a part in accelerating the decline of TV post-COVID or reviving the sector and engendering resilience within the sector. And I think the answer is for all of us to see. The regulator, after a 1.5-year disruption of the market because of a previous regulatory framework, is very keen to implement yet another one in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of attrition in the sector, and without requisite public consultation that has gone into this. The TRAI has a very good system of public consultation at the face of it.
Right.
They invite comments on consultation papers, and then they publish regulations.
Yeah.
But they never explain how their regulations pertain to the inputs that they have got, which is a best practice that you see in advanced jurisdictions.
True.
How many of those inputs, or qualitatively, what did stakeholders from different industries say, and how do you plan to balance those submissions? You can't take one view and run with it and think that it balances broadcasters, distributors, consumers, and even the state's view on this subject. These are all stakeholders in a sense in this broadcasting market that we have in India. So I think the regulatory design part is very important. And in all of these regulated markets, we have gone from a paradigm of pushing out goods and services to the maximum number of people so that they are included within the fold of the market economy that we have embraced over the last 30 years, and that has held us in good stead globally. And we have emerged on the global scene because of market-led growth and not because of the state. And therefore, it is time for us to think about what it takes to nurture and nourish these markets at times of crises and times of uncertainty, deep uncertainty that industry is witnessing, and so are consumers in terms of how much they wish to allocate to discretionary expenditure in particular.
That's really insightful. Thank you, Vivan. Let's take a little break here at this point. You're tuned to The Master's Voice, the podcast series from Mediabrief.com. I'm your host and friend Pavan R Chawla, and with me are two young masters, Vivan Sharan and Farah Bookwala. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. And we are back. Vivan, just to continue forward one thread from what you just said, that yes, there seems to be a good consultative process and people are called, you have open house discussions, but somehow what comes out, what follows those discussions doesn't seem to, at least to me, for sure, to me too, doesn't seem to have a logic thread as to what was discussed, what was put forth, and why this regulation. I mean, if I look at 2002, even as per the Quant Advisory report, the most difficult thing that happened with the conditional access system that was decided that will be rolled out was that it was very piecemeal. There were a lot of multiple delays on the whole thing. But when you look at, and that's history, yes, but when you look at 2004 onwards, okay, one of the most important things that happened was that distributors were routinely underreporting the number of subscribers, for instance, right? That always had the impact of having a lopsided mix between subscription and advertising revenues in India. And so tell me, if we look at 2011 onwards, as per the Quant Advisory report, what was it that they tried with the digital addressable system? And what do you think, how do you think they've gone ahead and impacted the broadcasters and the media entertainment system in India?
See, in 2011, and some of the listeners would perhaps better relate to this as a time when the countries or the regulators started transitioning the industry towards digital addressable systems or set-top boxes that would give users more control over what they were watching, and the government more transparency on the revenues and number of subscribers in this sector. And the logic, the political logic, the economic logic, and the consumer welfare logic nicely met at the intersection of digitization, and therefore it was pushed through. Now, what happened as a result of what happened in subsequent to this was that digitization meant different things to different operators. So the cable operator ecosystem, which is a very fragmented ecosystem. There were upwards of 60,000 local cable operators at the time. Today there are closer to 30,000. These are local to the very core, in the very real sense of the term. These are operators that sometimes operate out of hole-in-the-wall establishments in near residential areas and so on. Many of us have had interesting experiences interacting with these chaps when we wanted different cricket channels, for instance, over the course of the last decade. Whereas the DTH ecosystem, which is direct to home, Tata Skies and Dish TVs of the world, that operates on a very capital-intensive model. Each subscriber comes at a close to 3,000 rupee cost for the DTH distributor upfront, and then that's kind of clawed back in terms of revenues over time. And so the thing is that one is a very capital-intensive ecosystem. The other is heavily dependent on the natural local monopoly that a cable operator would have in a particular residential area. Because of these two different models, and this is unique from, say, the West, which we can go into later, where cable operators sometimes are larger than telecom companies. The fragmented nature of the cable ecosystem was never something that the TRAI considered as an area that required concerted effort to build capacity for digitization. And as a result, you have today a situation where about 60 million cable homes still do not receive the proper communication from cable operators, itemized bills, and effective choice. And this is because they have not had the capacity to put in place very basic systems at their end. For instance, there's something called a subscriber management system. The subscriber management system is supposed to give the larger distributors in this ecosystem, which are the multi-service operators, which are the Den and Hathaways of the world, that take the signal from the broadcasters upstream who produce content and or syndicate the Z's, Sonys of the world, to the local cable operators or the DTH operators. So these are the big intermediaries in the middle. The multi-service operators are supposed to have clear line of sight on how many subscribers local cable operators and dish TV and DTH operators have. But because of the non-installation or lack of understanding at the end of the local cable operators, or the lack of fiscal capacity to invest in these subscriber management systems, even today, there is a case to be made that the government is losing revenues on account of under-declaration by local cable operators of the number of subscribers that they have, because this system is not transparent, not audited, and an admission of this, a latest admission of this actually has come from the regulator itself. A couple of months back, the TRAI floated a consultation paper on technical compliance of conditional access system and subscriber management systems, where it actually acknowledges the deficiency in this ecosystem about 10 years after the fact that the digitization was initiated. Why did it take a decade to realize that there is something amiss? And even after that, the TRAI has chosen to impanel auditors within its midst that are largely chartered accountants. And 99% of the auditors that TRAI has are chartered accountants. So they can audit your financial books, which you can cook and so on and so forth. I mean, these are not Enrons that we are auditing in any case. So there is very little incentive on both sides to bring it up to a quality of audit that actually would benefit consumers or the state. But the point is that what are chartered accountants doing in this technical area where you really need an assessment and an honest assessment, and maybe even a compromise on part of the state and the industry to recognize where we really are, just like we are doing in the tax realm, where we are encouraging conversations between tax defaulters and the state to come to a middle path so that we grow the net of taxation in the country, so that more than the 20 million, 30 million people actually feed into this tax net. Similarly, we need a middle of the road kind of solution, reconciliation, and it all starts with a real admission that there is a problem in the cable ecosystem, that people didn't have money to digitize, or they didn't invest in digitization because they didn't have an incentive. Let us also remember, and we are a country of traders and retailers. Okay, therefore, and this is because historically there has been risk aversion in our society, because there has been threats of expropriation of private property. Most businesses are founded in an environment of scarcity. And this can only change with shared prosperity and wealth creation, as Prime Minister Modi wants us to walk down that path. But the fact that we are we come at these businesses with that kind of mindset where we will basically charge a fees for the carry. In the financial system, you have a carry trade. It's a carry trade that we are very used to, even in the cable ecosystem, where you put in the basic infrastructure that you need to bring a service to a consumer, but you don't want to invest in quality because it's not going to change the consumption appetite you feel that it's inelastic, and that you really not, you're always your natural monopoly will always be preserved somehow by the state, because it has reached this equilibrium in so many markets where the incumbency bias is high, because after a threshold number of businesses that enter that market and stay within it, there is very little political incentive to disrupt the apple cart. You can't come into a market with 30,000 to 40,000 cable operators and say, oh, you have to actually put in XYZ amount of money or you will not be able to operate. People will throw their hands up, there'll be political opposition, there'll be trade unionization, there'll be all sorts of trouble that the TRAI is not equipped to deal with. But the point is, it doesn't need to take that binary approach. It needs to enable the transition of cable operators so that they themselves survive the next 5 years, the next 10 years. I mean, again, I will draw the analogy with the retail ecosystem. In India, what is the imperative today for the state in terms of the 7 crore retailers that we have, imperative is that you have to push them on the path towards technology adoption, because as COVID has shown, they will soon be redundant in another decade if they do not adopt online commerce. That also, by the way, enables access to wider markets. So it's a similar kind of problem. It's an incumbency problem that we face across many markets. The TRAI is no different from any of the other regulators that we have that face this problem.
But to my mind, the TRAI did not ever demonstrate an alacrity to push in reform on the distribution side of things. Look at the QoS. I was speaking to Farah a little while before we started the podcast. Farah, do you want to talk about the new regulatory framework? You also studied the report very well, Farah, the Coan advisory report. Do you want to walk us through very briefly what was the basic regulation and what have been the consequences? The biggest one is that the consumers are suffering. To my mind, no consumer ever went to try and said, "Mera bill zyada hai, isko kam karwaiye."
So, to my mind, the biggest issue, a lot of ground has already been covered by Vivan, but let me just very quickly take a few points that are problematic with the new the NTO 1.0, as we say, or the new regulatory framework. Now, the first and the foremost problem is that, as Vivan has also pointed out earlier, we really do not know what were the market insights that were given to the regulator. What was the opinion that was pushed to the regulator which made them believe that the television industry in the first place required a new regulatory framework to be implemented? Because that was the time, 2017, 2018 was the perfect time for market incumbents to be actually increasing the quality of service that they provide to the end consumer rather than focusing on pricing, which in any case is a matter of much debate, because in India we don't really know who has gone and told the TRAI that we actually need to reduce cable bills. To my mind, consumers and a large section of the consumers were perfectly happy to be getting a bunch of 300 channels at 350 odd rupees a month. There is no evidence, no study anywhere that has been commissioned, in fact, to even suggest that consumers were averse to the whole bundling. I have never seen a consumer saying, "Oh, there are far too many channels on my channel. I have no idea what to watch." In fact, there was enough analysis to prove, and globally this has been proved, that bundling is the cheapest form of incentivization to any consumer, and it is abundantly followed in every sector, from aviation to, in fact, even telecom, which is regulated by the TRAI. So to suggest that, consumers only want to watch 50 channels and only want to pay for 50 channels, to my mind, the very premise itself was illogical, and that is where the first honest assessment starts for the TRAI. To first and foremost be transparent. When it talks about consumer transparency, the first thing that the TRAI, to my mind, should do is be transparent itself to suggest how have they derived, how have they deduced, or how have they come to this logical conclusion that consumers do not want 350 channels on their channels. Now, that honest assessment has not been forthcoming. In fact, it has not been coming for most of the regulations. If you look at the case of how TRAI is now trying to put its hands into the restructuring of the BARC, it goes on to state that some market incumbents have been saying that the BARC is in need of restructuring. Who are these incumbents? Who wants to have BARC restructured? The TRAI has never made any kind of references, and that is where, to a journalist, this seems very, very suspicious, because Absolutely. It means that there are certain vested interests out here that are pushing the TRAI in a certain corner of the industry, and it means that the larger interest of consumer welfare is not being protected. Now, the second problem with the tariff regulation was coming to price regulation. The TRAI has only recently at Wikiframes gone on to admit that it was in fact regulating prices, that the industry has been in the grips of direct and indirect price control since 2004, when it admitted on a public stage that there were genre-wise price caps implemented in the broadcast industry. It has never made this admission before. It has always said that we have freely allowed the market to operate as per forces of demand and supply. That, as you have already seen my earlier reportage on it also, to my mind, is a completely going away from the reality of the issue. So the new regulatory framework, as I see, is problematic because it began to regulate prices on the basis of a formula which again is unknown to any of us in the industry. How has the TRAI come to the conclusion that an MRP of 19 rupees on a channel is required so that a channel should be included in a bouquet? How have they subsequently come to a formula within a span of 8 months that says that no, the price of 19 rupees needs to come down down to 12 rupees.
12.
Because earlier there was an aberration.
Right.
How has an aberration come across? Then again,
And the limitation on bouquet prices, Farah.
the limitation on bouquet prices, that you can have a maximum discount of 33%. Where have we come across?
Ridiculous.
What is the formula that is being used to calculate? Because in all of this, the big point that I see is that the return on investment for a content creator has not been included. The incentivization for a content creator has not been included at all. And now the TRAI has gone on to admit that, for example, what we have in the form of NCF, the network capacity fee, is in fact an incentivization program for distributors. Now, this is again very, very problematic because it tilts the entire level playing field in favor of distributors who by themselves cannot independently stand without content creation taking place. So we are trying to protect the bottom of the pyramid with absolutely little regard for those at the very top, the creators of the content. We are not trying to make one, by this I'm not trying to say that the carriage creators are lower in the pyramid and the broadcast creators are superior. All I'm trying to say is that hierarchically they may be stacked in a particular way, but they need incentivizations in different ways to maintain the level playing field.
Exactly. In fact, Farah, ever since the new regulatory framework of 2017 came out, as the Cohen Advisory Report also says this, and I quote, it says there's been no change in content quality, business viability of small broadcasters has been threatened, niche channels are shutting down, and very, very few consumers, except perhaps in Delhi, have chosen the best fit plan.
So what is the best fit plan? Ultimately, the best fit plan is akin to bundling. The only thing that it does is that it incentivizes the distributors rather than the broadcasters. How do you arrive at a best fit plan? How do you say that 100 subscribers all need the best fit plan because this fits them best? So these are the kind of questions that we need to keep asking the TRAI. We need to get answers from. Unfortunately, the TRAI has not shown that it has been receptive to many of these comments as well. When the regulator constantly keeps saying that the broadcasters are misusing their freedom or are out to make a fool of consumers, and I say this verbatim, these were comments that were made on the Ficky platform, it only suggests that they are not open to the idea of understanding where content creators and how the economics of content creation are to be balanced with consumer welfare and incentivization for the last mile. So the NRF, as I point out, post the NRF being implemented, I did a study which showed that most cable operators were indulging in rampant piracy. Piracy has in fact gone on to increase 300% after the introduction of the new regulatory framework, which again surprisingly has not made any provisions to address piracy, which is a rampant issue under declaration of the CAS SMS system, which has not addressed anything around local cable operators and the quality of services that need to be enforced at their end. Today, very briefly, let me tell you what is happening at the last mile level from my assessment. At the last mile level, the local cable operator has made it abundantly clear that they do not have the wherewithal to keep changing your channels on a month-on-month basis. That is something that the TRAI wants you to have the freedom to do, but they clearly do not have. Most local cable operators, as Vivan said, operate out of really small, dingy establishments with monopolies in that area. They usually have two small boys who run around to get payments from your customers. Today, when you try to reach out to any local cable operator, you will find it very difficult to change your channels. You will find it very difficult to get an itemized bill for all the individual channels that you're picking up. And most importantly, the bulk of the increase in your cable bill, which has increased anywhere between 30 to 70%, is coming from the NCF of 130 rupees that you have paid, which is and the other amount of the individual channels are barely 19 rupees, 5 rupees, 6 rupees. How many channels are you going to choose over and above the 100 free-to-air channels? At the very best, a maximum of 20-25 channels. That is not forming the bulk of your cost, which is something which is completely contrarian to what the TRAI had initially premised the NRF on.
Absolutely, the local cable bills are increasing and consumers are under a lot of strain and stress. Let me bring Vivan into the discussion. Vivan, your back of the envelope assessment of the kind of damage that this new regulatory framework on the broadcasting industry has had, the impact on the business. I mean, I heard a really respected media leader like Sanjay Gupta speak about it at Ficky Frames. He called for light-handed regulation. And so what do you think? I mean, what is the impact going to be like? What is the size of the industry? What is the potential it really has? And what is your advice, Vivan, for the next incumbent of TRI who's coming in? As somebody, as an expert who studied the space, who has a really wonderful, holistic and informed view on it, why don't you just share your views on this, please, in brief?
The entire media and entertainment industry is about a $20 billion industry. That, of course, has huge upside potential. India must become a media and entertainment hub for the world, and we can become a $100 billion industry. Within this industry, broadcasting accounts for about 50% in revenue. Therefore, it is not one to be easily discounted. By the way, broadcasting also accounts for about, and broadcasting, the various fees and license fees, etc., that are charged on broadcasters account for 85% or so of the MIB's revenues as well, the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, which would not exist without this sector. So the point is, we have perhaps in India the largest broadcast content creation base in the world. We have the largest number of subscribers outside of China. And if you think about the economics or even the basic logic of any market transition, I am not here arguing to say that broadcast will survive a 50-year period. It's like saying that print media will survive 50 years. No one can make that assessment. But we can certainly make an assessment in India today about print media and broadcasting alike, that there is more demand for both these services in India than there is in the West, where cord cutting has become rampant and people are on Netflix and other services. India has a culture of large households, of people sitting down together and watching TV, and it is very much part of our cultural fabric, TV. And therefore, I truly believe that if policymakers were to do an honest assessment, they would give TV, broadcast TV as we know it, another 5 to 10 years of a good run. Now, why I said market transition was that unless broadcasters are able to generate surpluses from their core business and invest them into new businesses, which they have incidentally over the last 5 years. India is one of the few countries in the world which has over 50 over-the-top video platforms, many of which are run, the largest of which are run by broadcasters. If the broadcasters are not able to continuously generate surpluses that they can feed into transition, we will have a situation which we fear the most, which is that we will have monopolies in the digital market. Those can be domestic or foreign, but we will not have the ability to compete in an industry where we have such a strong base. What a shame that would be on us all in terms of the kind of policy design and outcomes that we want. So coming back to this, I think the advice, and I'm nobody to advise any regulatory authority, they can simply choose to listen to the voices outside of the very narrow fold of people who may come and critique them directly. I think two or three things. One is that the nature of public consultations needs to change. If you look at the model of the FCC, which is the regulator in the US, which looks at this market, the FCC allows 1 year of consultation time on most major regulatory decisions, post which it issues a draft regulation, which too is up for debate. What is the hurry in India? And I have never understood this. What is the hurry in India without identifying a market failure to intervene in a market? And that too, to do so over a Christmas break or a Diwali break when people are least prepared.
Correct.
Mentally, existentially, and I mean both industry and consumers.
Correct.
Now, the thing is, so one is that a transparent public consultation process means much more than publishing something on a website and saying people can comment freely. Second is that you have to, as Farah said, balance the interests of all stakeholders in the market. You can't take a discriminatory view because you believe that broadcasters are represent big business and distributors represent the underprivileged class of businesses, and therefore there should be incumbency bias or bias towards the downstream where there are many more people employed and so on. Because as we discussed right now, 5 or 10 years down the line, if these businesses have not pivoted to fully digital businesses and consolidated, they will not survive in any case. The problem is, of course, that we have 5-year political cycles. So short-termism is in order even in the regulatory sphere, despite the fact that regulators are supposed to be independent.
Right.
Now, on this point, I have a point for not the regulator per se, but the parliament. We say today that regulators are accountable to the people because the parliament is supposed to ask them questions, and the parliament is a representation of people's voices.
Right.
If we do a very basic analysis of how many parliamentary questions have been aimed at regulators to deconstruct economic regulation and not something wider that is more populist, the answer in TRAI's case would be maybe less than half a dozen questions over the last 5 or 10 years, which have actually been aimed at deconstructing how the TRAI goes about any kind of economic regulation, be it price setting, discount caps, whatever. So if the parliament doesn't know what a regulator is actually doing to intervene in markets without making explicit what the failure of that market is, how are people like us at the very periphery of policy thinking supposed to influence or impact good regulatory design? I don't think we can do it, and therefore the legislature, it is incumbent upon the legislature to review regulatory design, to review constructs of accountability, particularly when it comes to the economy and economic regulation, given that today more than ever we need private investments, we need the private sector to thrive, and we need trust, most of all, between all market participants, particularly in markets that are transitioning. And if the regulator does a job at actually eroding that trust by saying that one or the other market participant has an expropriatory bias, that they are there in that market only to make profits. By the way, I don't understand that logic either. I mean, I don't know which businessman would enter a market where there is no profit to be made. So questioning the profit motive of broadcasters, this is something that has been done in open house discussions by the years. That you have a profit motive, and that's an accusation in a country like ours with 30 years of a liberal market track record. I think it's time to revisit very, very basic fundamentals of how we regulate markets today. And the legislature, be it through new sort of legislative principles on regulatory design of regulators, or be it through some new accountability mechanisms that actually question how regulators make decisions. If we don't do these things, there's going to be regulatory capture across the board. Some stakeholders will always have a larger voice than others, and you will have disputes in sectors that erode value and trust. In the broadcasting sector, by the way, you have close to 4 times the number of disputes as in telecom just last year.
Right.
And that is indicative of, what is a regulator for if not to reduce the number of disputes? That is very much a proxy or a parameter within orderly market growth, which is their legislated mandate. One half of it. So one half of it, very clearly they're not doing. The other half, which is consumer welfare, where 26 million people leave your ecosystem, what is the welfare of, or what is the consumer surplus you've generated that has led to that? So I think outcomes have to be assessed now. We can't keep drawing up these 5-10 year grand plans of how we want to develop sectors. Let's take a pause, assess regulatory outcomes against legislated mandates, and think about regulatory design better. And the regulator itself should be propositional and involve itself in these debates, rather than every couple of months release a consultation paper that gives palpitation to industry stakeholders. And the consumers are, of course, blissfully unaware unless the topic is taken to a level where awareness is generated, like network neutrality, which is once in a 10-year cycle, where you have actually consumer participation and therefore political participation in a regulatory process. Otherwise, these are black boxes across the board. So regulatory transparency is not just the mandate of the regulator, it is the mandate of the legislature. And all of us as people have to understand that it is well within our rights to demand that transparency, to demand that our representatives ask for that accountability, because accountability cannot be always an inverted pyramid, where we as taxpayers and citizens are the most accountable and those sitting on top are the least
accountable. Absolutely. And Vivan, thank you very much for actually spelling out the broad approach and the recommended route ahead. I would also like to add one little thing to this, that even as we review how it's happened so far and what really needs to be done, how to approach it going ahead, I do feel that the 2017 regulation that was announced needs to really be relooked at. And if I had my way, I would say let's go back to pre-17. and let the market grow in a decent free way, which is really going to be the most consumer friendly, if you ask me. You also mentioned OTT platforms, Vivan. There have been rumors that TRAI is going to come out with a consultation process to bring video OTTs also under regulation on the basis of complaints from DPOs who allege that there is a lack of parity. The wise thing to do is to actually lower the licensing and regulatory burden on the linear broadcasting sector to compete with the emerging platforms rather than bring such new platforms under regulatory burdens, don't you think? Isn't it akin to putting a cart before the horse and then, killing the sector before it takes off? Reducing the regulatory burden on the broadcasters will also allow the consumers to choose whatever is best for them. What do you think, Vivan and Farah?
I'll just give a 2-second answer to that, and then Farah can take over.
Yeah.
I think leveling the playing field is a great principle as long as it comes with all the requisite caveats. You can't level the playing field between two businesses that operate on different infrastructure. You can't level the playing field between two businesses with completely different economic model of operation. You can't level the playing field, or you shouldn't level the playing field by regulating the unregulated business upwards and the over-regulated business downwards. And again, this speaks to how the leveling the playing field is the favorite ploy or the ask of the incumbent. So if we want India to remain in this trade unionist mode, we don't like trade unions, but we like our companies to become trade unionists in a sense. It's a strange paradigm where they can keep saying, no, we don't want disruption, we don't want competition, we don't want the regulator to do anything that makes life easier for someone trying something innovative. We want status quo. Change is something antithetical to national interest, public interest, consumer interest, and so on, which is of course not true. The world has moved on. Whether our industries move on or not will be the litmus test of whether India is able to go forth in this century and actually become the economic superpower that it was destined to be at least 20 years ago when we were positioning ourselves in Davos as such.
Right. Farah, you want to add to that?
Yes. So, if the TRAI were to admit where these 26 million subscribers who have moved out of the pay TV ecosystem have gone after the implementation of the NTO, they would know that they have not gone anywhere. They're right here amidst us. It's just that they have moved to these digital technologies. Today, amongst the millennial youth, you can literally find every third person who has probably cut off television in their households or are no longer watching or are migrated completely to OTT platforms. And there is a reason. The reason is because the broadcast industry, despite the potential that it has, despite the quantitative base that it has been able to set up, has not been able to give us quality content that today we are able to, one, afford. Number two, is going to be available to us from an alternate platform if you don't offer it. So you might as well plug that void by giving it yourself. And as Vivan said, always making a level playing field is going to keep an industry boxed, is not going to allow us to move out and compete on a global scale. And what are we eventually doing? Today, if you look at the way, for me as a journalist, if you look at the absolutely devastating way, when I use the word devastating because for someone like me who has grown into the principles of journalism, to watch the way today the case of somebody like Sushant Singh Rajput's death is being reported. What is the fallout? Okay, we've talked about the modalities, we've talked about TRAI, we've talked about everything. Let's talk about the biggest consequence. What is the biggest consequence of what the TRAI has done through price regulation? I have put that at the very forefront of the article that I wrote, that it has completely made the content that we watch today unwatchable. Today, when you look at the news space, today what has happened? What happened last night? You had a news channel interrogating the main criminal accused in the case on national television. We have bypassed every single journalistic ethic. We have bypassed the society's norms. We have bypassed what the society and police together requires us to do. And we are now interrogating criminals. The absolutely horrendous microscopic investigation into this case shows how there is unmasked profiteering, voyeurism, and the TRP-ridden game that we are now playing on television, because this is what we have reduced ourselves to. The TRAI's policies have completely made broadcasters so dependent on viewership, TRP and advertising revenues that today you have news content being being peddled in the name, what is being peddled in the name of truth is basically nothing more than, is worse than fiction. You can rather watch. So this fallout has to be assessed. As Vivan says, regulatory outcomes have to be assessed. And what the OTT platform is doing, there is a very important thing. Why today the DPOs want that space to be regulated? Yes. But do you know why the government is interested in regulating the space? Because today the OTT ecosystem is basically telling you certain truths about the Indian ecosystem that they do not want to be told. You can regulate news, you can regulate TV content, but OTT, as long as it stays outside, will give you content that is controversial, that is strong, and which is something that definitely does not play into the interest of the government. And that is why they want to regulate it, which to my mind is a very, very, very dangerous thing to do, because it is setting a very wrong precedent for any new technology, for any new ecosystem that is trying to build itself in India today. So that is the very brief commentary that I would like to give on.
Let's take a little break here at this point. You're tuned to The Master's Voice, the podcast series from Mediabrief.com. I'm your host and friend Pavan R Chawla, and with me are two young masters, Vivan Sharan and Farah Bookwala. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. And we are back. So now, in 30 seconds each, Vivan, starting with you, your assessment of this 2017 regulation, and what's your view on it?
My view is, sir, if you start a business, suppose you start a food delivery business, and you're told that in that application through which consumers can order food through your business, that you have to price the cap of certain, and this is a fast food delivery, so it's not essential. I'm not delivering some cereals and pulses to you. In my business, you tell me that I can't sell anything for more than 19 rupees. I can't give you a combination of dishes for a cost that I think is value for money. I can't even offer you, I can't offer people who carry my food to you any kind of incentives to do so by way of giving them extra money or discounts to consumers. Is it a fair number of constraints that I have to operate with as I start this fast food business? Now, the problem really is that no democracy in the world regulates prices of content as we do.
Right.
Why are we exceptional? Because are we the only country in the world that has people at the bottom of the pyramid? Are we the only country in the world with poverty? We also have a public broadcaster that is supposed to fill that void. We have 700 free channels. So what is the logic for Indian exceptionalism in broadcast regulation? I have never understood.
Telling indeed. Farah, would you like to add to that? 30 seconds.
Not really, except that I think that the TRAI needs to indulge in some honest self-assessment of whether they really have the wherewithal to continue, or whether the government really needs to act upon its intended promise to set up an independent and autonomous body that can sort of do the job. More importantly, I think that any new body should first and foremost develop the ability to listen to criticism that sort of is not criticism intended for the sake of criticism, but criticism that is aimed at improving the intended consequences or outcomes of what the sector desires, which is something that the TRAI has not respected. If you look very quickly, if I were to say today that the number of news outlets that are allowed to critique the TRAI's approach have been diminishing very, very quickly over the last 3 to 4 years, whereas we are not even talking about criticism of the government. We are talking criticism about a regulator who, by the very nature of the job that they do, are expected and should expect subsequent amount of or a copious amount of criticism to come their way. But they have shut down all attempts to sort of critique what they do, and that, to my mind, is the very first step to ensuring that the broadcast sector can in fact go on to the path of growth and development.
Right, and in fact, the regulator has also, to my mind, displayed undue, unholy haste in trying to push this regulation through, and the implementation first they came out with this direction that said till the 10th of August publish your REO rates and everything else, and now we are waiting for
Please note that the NTO 2.0 is being implemented at a time when the matter is still sub judice.
Right. And at a time when the economy is in such a bad state, not just the Indian, but the whole global economy. Look at COVID and the pandemic. So thank you very, very much indeed. We could have gone on and on with this discussion. I had about 25 more questions. Maybe we'll take those up later. Thank you very, very much indeed. Let me thank the lady first. Farah, wonderful journalist, wonderful writer, and extremely well informed about the space. And Vivan, one of the leaders, thought leaders in the entire space of media marketing, broadcast, research, the use of data, and which is grounded in society for better implementation, better impact for the general good by any company that wants to use it. So thank you both, young masters, for being on the Master's Voice on Mediabrief.com. I'm your host and friend Pavan R Chawla. Thank you, Farah. Thank you, Vivan.
No, this was wonderful. I wish we could talk, like you said, for hours because there's just so much water under the bridge, and it's so important, I think, to declutter, from all the noise and commentary around the economy. Really, what are the prescriptions that are required? Because I think we all have a role in being constructive and suggesting things that can help us on the path to growth, development, and so on. And we don't have enough such discussions where solutions are discussed and problems are deconstructed in a way that that can help.
Wow. Thank you, Vivan. Farah?
Yeah, well, I think this is a great initiative, and I think we must do more of this. This is great for me personally as well, because it is one more medium for me to project a voice that not too many people want to hear about. Criticism is in today's news era is not taken too nicely, and therefore any journalist who tries to project even a neutral stand, placing facts at the very forefront, is often deemed partisan, biased, or prejudiced. But this may not be the intention at the very outset, to be very honest. So I'm glad that we have an opportunity to project a voice that in effect is only going to help the ecosystem take an honest, do an honest reality check, and then sort of, grow from there. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you both, gracious people, knowledgeable people. So this was The Master's Voice, the latest episode from Mediabrief.com. I'm your host and friend Pavan R Chawla. Till I come back with similarly inspiring, stellar young professionals and experts in the next episode, I'm going to say, stay safe. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.